But first, Martin and Kevin, I'd just like to bring up that item that we heard in the news there about the cyber attack on the National Health Service again. I know we mentioned it in the last hour, but it basically occurs to me, why is it that someone can't immediately get to the root of the problem by probing this bank account that everyone's supposed to be putting their money into that's part of this hack? Because surely that would lead them immediately to the people who are behind it. Kevin, you first.
Again, there are all sorts of questions like that need to be asked. Oddly, computer crime, in one sense, ought to be the easiest to detect, precisely how you have said. You can follow the trail. It doesn't get burnt. You know, it's there. It may be complicated, but it is there.
The banks will probably say, oh, well, I'm sorry, that information's confidential, when the police knock on their door or phone them up.
This is where you get caught in a contradiction about the police, having these new powers to dive into anything they want and put surveillance on everything. But they don't seem able to use it when there's a crisis there. This is the real question. The powers are all there in the law. Why aren't they working? I
think the other thing is the police will say, well, it can take us weeks to get access to a bank, to get all the correct approvals for them to tell us who, for example, the signatories are on this bank account, where the people are being asked at the National Health Service right now to put money into that account, and yet the police can't find out probably for weeks who the signatories are and where the money would be then transferred to.
Yeah, but again, that's an excuse I've never understood. If the police have, a drug suspect, something more obvious, they get a warrant from a magistrate in 4 hours. What's the problem with bank accounts?
What do you make of this? Let's just try and grapple with this story that's in the news today.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with legitimate law enforcement being able to find out whatever they need to find out, hard drives, whatever they need to look at. But this general surveillance of the population to stop terrorism is we've already got all the powers that the police need to investigate crime already exist. They've been on the statute book forever. They don't need extra powers. That's absurd. And of course, Theresa May is very much part of the one of those that's been pushing for extra powers to prevent terrorist attacks and so on. Now, of course, the real problem is that the terrorists may be inside the structure, as we're going to discuss in a moment about what's been going on in Germany. And the real problem there is not the powers of the police to investigate. It's that they don't want to investigate because the people they're investigating are too powerful and are able to tell them to back off.
Yeah, further up the chain. Theresa May got the Investigatory Powers Act on the statute book. That act can't work. Mass surveillance that is included in the Act, bulk collection they call it, the same thing, is a breach of the most basic rights in the European Charter of Human Rights. So, of course, her other plot is to take the UK out not only of the EU, but out of the European Council, the Council of Europe. And so that there's we, the people of Britain, are victims of this.
Let me just
act.
make it clear, because certainly the stuff I've read is that it looks like for at least the next 10 years, Britain will be staying in the European Court of Human Rights, but not in the European Court of Justice, which is the thing they've got the big beef with. For example, the European Court of Justice has just ruled that any employer can sack someone from wearing a headscarf. And they say it's not religious discrimination. No. So there are two different separate courts.
Yeah, no, they're totally, and most people don't understand the distinction. However, the court that convicted her American friends of mass surveillance and criminal activity was the European Court of Justice, not the Human Rights Court. The case never went there. No wonder she's anxious to get out from under it.
Sounds like a whole load of legal juggling just to get around the law. Anyway, let's get on to this German army calling for searches of all barracks after Nazi memorabilia is found. This is the head of Germany's armed forces. Called for an inspection of all army barracks after investigators discovered neo-Nazi military memorabilia in a garrison, broadening a scandal about right-wing extremism amongst soldiers. The discovery at a barracks in Dönigsingen, if I pronounce that right, Donaueschingen, I think that's probably the best way to say it, in southwest Germany, made an investigation that began after similar Nazi-era items were found in the garrison of an army officer arrested on suspicion of planning a racially motivated attack. As a result, General Inspector Volker Wieker, he has ordered a wider search of barracks right across the country. So, Martin, this has also been sanctioned by Defence Secretary Ursula von der Leyen. She said the military must root out all right-wing extremism, and yet this is actually very serious, isn't it? We're talking about not necessarily neo-Nazis, but Nazis. We're talking about soldiers who are venerating Hitler, actually serving soldiers right now within the German army.
Well, what interests me about this is what are the connections of this guy? I think the police have done a very good job to catch the individual, because he'd already stashed a pistol in Vienna airport. What the plan was that he was going to turn up, pick up this pistol, carry out an attack. The pistol would then be left, and he would escape. And a big question in my mind: how would you escape? He must have had some means, because of course if he was arrested on the spot red-handed, then they wouldn't have been able. And what he'd done previously is, as a serving German army officer, he'd gone and pretended to be a Syrian asylum seeker, given his fingerprints to the the people that deal with these things, so that it will then appear to be an asylum seeker who had carried out the attack. And of course, he then would have escaped from Vienna airport, and presumably his finger would not have been traced. Now, in other words, he would have been protected. Now, we know similar things have happened in Germany in the past. So, for example, a few years ago, there were assassinations of various Turkish shopkeepers and so on. And the way it was investigated by the police was that it was some kind of internal feud in the Turkish community. And it was eventually uncovered that these assassinations, 10 or 12, had been carried out by neo-Nazis and had been protected by the BND, the German intelligence services. And of course this fits a pattern going back decades of Western intelligence services being involved in false flag terrorism.
Well, von der Leyen said the military had not taken the threat of right-wing extremism seriously enough. She says you have reason to dig deeper to the military. She said, noting that 18 members of the armed forces had been dismissed for right-wing extremist views since 2012. But Kevin, this is we have not been told his rank, but he was an officer who managed, with others, they believe, to squirrel away at least 1,000 rounds of ammunition.
Yeah, if you're in a military force, officer or any other rank, it's not that difficult. The problem with, I don't think it's the German. One of the post-war crimes against the population of Europe, media-type crimes, was the division of the German army into the bad Wehrmacht and the bad SS and the good Wehrmacht. If you were a Russian, they were all the same. They were all fascists because they murdered most Russians they ever met.
Yes, they weren't very good at treating Russian prisoners of war well,
no.
were they?
And this was the Wehrmacht. This wasn't the SS. So the German army is still contaminated from World War II, but I see...
Isn't it about time that the German army surrendered to the Russians? Because they refused to do that at the end of the Second World War, Martin, didn't they? They surrendered to the Allies, that is the British and the Americans, but they never did to Moscow.
Yeah, I think there's...
No, can I correct you? Do you mind?
I'm not quite sure.
The person who translated the German surrender in Berlin was a man called Boris Bratters, a friend of mine. He was Zhukov's translator, and when we were at college, we didn't know who he was, but he had a photographic memory, and he gave us the German surrender word for word.
Oh, so they did?
The Germans did surrender to the Russians in Berlin.
I think maybe I'm getting a bit confused with the Japanese, Singapore maybe, something like that.
Who never surrendered to the Russians. Yes, they have never. There's a ceasefire, but no peace treaty.
And also, of course, the situation we'll be coming on to a bit later with North and South Korea, Martin.
Yeah, well, there is no... Yeah, but there's just a ceasefire there.
I suspect that the sudden urge to clean up the German army is coming from Merkel. Merkel has realised there's a problem. It's taken her a while to wake up, I think. But there is a problem.
Can I just say, it's not just that the German army has got the recidivist Nazis in it. What worries me is that this is part of a general pattern of Western intelligence services, not just the German intelligence services, also MI6 and the CIA, of fomenting both right-wing and left-wing terrorism. Just think if this guy had managed to succeed in what he wanted to do. He's carried out an attack in Vienna airport, he's killed loads of random tourists, he's escaped, and of course the word goes out that this is another terrorist attack by these evil Muslims from Syria, blah, blah, blah. And of course it may well be that the previous attacks that we've seen are of exactly this kind.
Exactly. We heard last week, Martin, didn't we, about the Dortmund bus attack actually being done by somebody who was actually just a criminal who was trying to make money, not a terrorist at all. They're just an ordinary criminal.
Well, also, I'd like to mention, if we're going to mention Dortmund, the Dortmund beer hall massacre in 1980. Which the police eventually uncovered was actually carried out by NATO intelligence services as part of Operation Gladio. Now, we know, because we've had decades of investigation of this, that NATO intelligence services routinely engage in terrorist activities. The bombing of Bologna railway station, again in 1980, Italian police absolutely convinced that was carried out by NATO. The same NATO that Theresa May thinks that we've absolutely got to be a part of, otherwise Jeremy Corbyn will prevent us from being part of it, and so on and so forth. People need to know the history of NATO. NATO is, as Donald Trump said, obsolete, except he's changed his mind like he does. What
do you make of NATO, Kevin?
It's what it has always been. It's an instrument of the United States to create tension with Russia, so the United States arms industry can sell arms to Europe. During the presidential campaign, the one thing that got the Americans panicked was when Trump was saying the NATO allies are going to have to start paying up. They already do. The biggest trade imbalance in the world is the military one, because most of the NATO forces buy American weapons. It's just a way of raising the tensions so that weapons are sold by the Americans to NATO.